You are trying to live forever. That is the whole reason you are here, bent over a furnace, breathing fumes that sting your eyes, watching a pot of strange powders glow in the dark. You are not a soldier. You are not a killer. You are a holy man, a seeker, a scientist of the soul. Your emperor wants to cheat death, and he has ordered you to find the recipe that will let him do it. So, night after night you mix minerals, salts, things pulled from the earth and the fire and the strange yellow crust that grows near hot springs. You are looking for the elixir of life. And one night the mixture in front of you does something no medicine should ever do. It does not heal. It does not soothe. It erupts. A flash of heat and light and smoke throws you backward, singes your eyebrows, and fills the room with a smell you will never forget. You were reaching for immortality. What you found instead was the exact opposite. You found a way to kill on a scale no human had ever imagined. This is not a myth. This is roughly how the deadliest accident in human history actually happened. And the question underneath it is stranger than the explosion itself. Why were your ancestors so desperate to live forever that they were willing to mix poison after poison, blow up their own homes, and keep going anyway? To understand gunpowder, you cannot start with war. You have to start with the fear of death. Because gunpowder was never invented. It was stumbled upon by people running from the one thing none of us can escape. For most of your life, you have probably been told a simple version of this story. Gunpowder comes from China. It led to guns. Guns changed everything. And all of that is true. But it flattens the strangest part completely. The people who created the most destructive substance of the pre-modern world were not weapon makers. They were the opposite. They were Taoist alchemists, religious philosophers who believed the human body could be perfected, purified, and made to last forever. The search for eternal life gave birth to a tool of mass death. The reach for more life produced more ways to end it. And that is not a coincidence or a cruel joke of history. It is a window into something deep and permanent about the mind you are carrying around inside your own skull right now. So let's go back, not to a battlefield, to a laboratory thousands of years ago lit by fire. The story begins earlier than most people think. Long before the first explosion, Chinese emperors were already obsessed with not dying. One of the most famous was Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty, who ruled more than 2,000 years ago. Wu Di, as he is often called, was one of the most powerful men on earth, and he wanted that power to last forever. So, he commanded his court alchemists, the religious scientists of his empire, to find him a potion of immortality. These alchemists began heating and combining every substance they could find. Among the many things they experimented with were two that will matter enormously later. Sulfur, the yellow foul-smelling mineral that gathers around volcanic springs, and saltpeter, a strange white crystal that seemed to bloom out of the ground and out of old walls, which they poetically called Chinese snow. They never found immortality, of course. Nobody ever has. But they learned something about these materials. They learned that sulfur and saltpeter were not ordinary. They were reactive, powerful, and a little bit dangerous. And they filed that knowledge away generation after generation, passing it down through centuries of failed attempts to defeat death. The written traces of this obsession go back astonishingly far. Around the year 142, a Chinese alchemist named Boyang wrote a text that many consider one of the oldest works on alchemy in the world. In it, he describes certain powders that, when combined, would fly and dance with violent energy. He was not describing a bomb. He was describing the strange, lively behavior of substances he was studying in his search for spiritual and physical transformation. But reading it now, more than 1,800 years later, it is hard not to feel a chill. The dance he described was the first faint rumor of the explosion to come. A century or two later, another towering figure enters the story. Hong, a scholar and alchemist who lived around the year 300, wrote extensively about the practice of heating minerals in the search for immortality. Among the substances he documented were saltpeter and other reactive ingredients handled and heated in exactly the kind of experiments that would centuries later produce fire. Picture Hong in his workshop, patient and devout, convinced that the right combination of Earth's minerals could unlock eternal life. He was building, without knowing it, the exact body of knowledge that his descendants would one day trip over and set alight. The road to gunpowder was paved by holy men, one careful experiment at a time. Here is the twist that makes this early chapter so haunting. Some of the very substances these alchemists were feeding to emperors as medicine were slowly poisoning them. Historians believe several Chinese rulers may have died from consuming elixirs laced with mercury and other toxins, believing right up until the end that they were extending their lives. So, before gunpowder ever killed a single soldier, the quest that created it was already killing kings. The reach for eternal life was lethal, long before it learned how to explode. Now, move forward several centuries into the Tang Dynasty more than 1,000 years ago. The obsession has not faded. If anything, it has deepened, refined into a whole tradition of Taoist alchemy with its own texts, its own masters, and its own carefully guarded recipes. And it is here, in this world of furnaces and philosophy, that our substance finally reveals itself. We can actually date the moment it appears in writing, thanks to the work of historians who have combed through these ancient Chinese texts. Most famously, the great British scholar Joseph Needham, who spent much of his life documenting the science of old China. In a Taoist text compiled around the year 808, there is a recipe. It describes combining saltpeter sulfur and a dried plant material, and it records what happened next. Flames erupted. Hands and faces were burned. Houses caught fire. Sit with that image for a moment. A quiet room. A scholar in robes leaning over his work, expecting perhaps a healing smoke or a spiritual vapor. And instead, a burst of fire that scars his skin and sets the roof alight. He was not building a weapon. He was almost certainly still chasing some version of health, purity, or transcendence. The explosion was an intruder, an accident, an unwelcome guest. And here is the detail that tells you everything about how they saw it. They did not call it a weapon. They called it Huoyao, fire medicine. Even after it burned them, they still filed it under medicine, because medicine was what they had been looking for. The name stuck. To this day, the Chinese word for gunpowder still carries that ancient meaning, fire medicine, a permanent linguistic fossil of the moment humanity's deadliest powder was mistaken for a cure. But if that first text sounds like a discovery, the next one sounds like a warning. And warnings are even more revealing. Around the year 850, another Taoist text appears, one whose title translates roughly as the classified essentials of the mysterious Tao of the origin of things. And this text does something remarkable. It explicitly tells alchemists to stop. It warns them not to mix saltpeter sulfur and certain other ingredients together because doing so causes disaster. It describes, in effect, a formula precisely so that people will avoid it. Think about what that means. For a religious author to write a warning this specific, the accidents must have been happening again and again. Alchemists across China were clearly stumbling into the same violent reaction, burning themselves, destroying their workshops, and yet coming back to the furnace the next day to try once more. The warning is a fingerprint of obsession. You do not need to tell people to stop doing something unless they cannot seem to stop doing it. And this raises the question that sits at the heart of the whole story. Why couldn't they stop? What was so powerful about the promise of eternal life that people kept risking death to chase it? To answer that, you have to leave the ancient laboratory for a moment and look inside your own head. Because the thing that drove those alchemists is the same thing living inside you. Here is what the science says about why humans behave this way. Your brain is not primarily built to make you happy. It is built to keep you alive and to make you want things. Deep inside your brain sits a system that runs on a chemical called dopamine. You may have heard dopamine described as the pleasure chemical, but that is not quite right. Dopamine is better understood as the wanting chemical, the chemical of pursuit. It does not spike when you get the reward. It spikes when you are chasing it, when the goal is close but not yet grasped. There is a specific piece of brain machinery behind this. Deep in the middle of your brain sits a small region, part of what scientists call the mesolimbic pathway, that floods forward with dopamine whenever you anticipate something valuable. Researchers studying this system, including the neuroscientist Wolfram Schultz, whose experiments on reward prediction became famous, found something counterintuitive. The brain's dopamine neurons fire hardest, not at the moment of reward, but at the moment of expectation, and especially when the reward is uncertain. Uncertainty, it turns out, is rocket fuel for the wanting system. A reward you are sure of is boring. A reward you might get if you just try one more time is intoxicating. Let that sink in because it explains the alchemist perfectly. The pursuit itself was the drug. Each failed experiment, each near miss, each tantalizing hint that the secret of immortality might be just one more mixture away would have kept that dopamine system firing. The seeking felt meaningful. The goal felt almost within reach. And the very uncertainty of it, the fact that immortality was always promised but never delivered, is exactly the condition that locks a brain into obsessive pursuit. A brain caught in that loop will keep going long past the point where an outside observer would say, "Stop, this is madness, you are burning your own house down." Now add the second deeper layer. Human beings are the only animal we know of that fully understands it is going to die. Psychologists have a name for the machinery we build to cope with that knowledge. Some call it terror management theory, developed by researchers, including Sheldon Solomon and his colleagues, building on the ideas of the anthropologist Ernest Becker. The core idea is that a huge amount of human culture, religion, art, monument building, and empire making is quietly powered by our need to defend against the raw terror of our own mortality. We cannot bear the thought of simply ending, so we build things meant to outlast us, and we chase symbols of permanence and immortality wherever we can find them. An emperor commanding his alchemists to find the elixir of life is terror management in its purest form. He is a man with more power than almost anyone alive, and yet he is still helpless before death, so he throws his entire kingdom at the problem. And notice how the fear does not make him passive. It makes him act, order, build, and demand. The terror of death is not a quiet dread. It is an engine. It drives people to do enormous, world-changing things, some beautiful and some monstrous, all in the shadow of the same simple fact: one day this ends. Put those two things together. A wanting machine of a brain that loves the chase, bolted on top of a creature that is terrified of dying. That combination does not just explain the invention of gunpowder. It explains a huge amount of everything humans have ever done. And it means the explosion in that Tang Dynasty workshop was not really an accident of chemistry. It was almost inevitable given the kind of mind that was doing the mixing. And there is a strange chemical poetry to why it was these particular ingredients that carried the fire. The secret, the true key, was the saltpeter. In plain terms, burning normally needs oxygen from the air, which is why you can smother a candle by cutting off its air. But saltpeter potassium nitrate is a substance packed with its own oxygen locked inside its chemistry. When it heats up alongside sulfur and charcoal, it releases that oxygen in a sudden rush, letting the mixture burn almost instantly all at once, without waiting for the air. That is the difference between a fire and an explosion. Not magic, just a mineral that carried its own breath. The alchemists had, without understanding any of the chemistry, stumbled onto the one common substance on Earth that could make fire feed itself. They thought they had found a spiritual secret. What they had actually found was a loophole in the physics of burning. So the powder existed. People knew it was dangerous. And for a while, remarkably, they mostly used it for wonder rather than war. The earliest widespread use of this fire medicine was not on the battlefield. It was in the sky. The Chinese began packing the powder into tubes of bamboo and paper to create dazzling bursts of light and sound. Fireworks. Celebrations. The same violent reaction that burned the alchemist's hands was tamed into beauty, used to frighten away evil spirits and mark festivals and honor the dead. For a brief window in history, humanity's deadliest discovery was mostly a source of joy and awe, painting color across the night. Imagine standing in a Chinese city on a festival night 1,000 years ago, hearing the crack and boom overhead, watching sparks rain down in reds and golds, believing that the noise itself was driving away the demons that brought sickness and misfortune. To those people, the powder was still, in a sense, medicine. It protected. It celebrated life, rather than ending it. There is something almost unbearably poignant in that. For one shining moment, humanity held the most destructive substance it would ever create and chose to make the night beautiful with it. It would not stay that way. But it never stays innocent for long. Because the human mind that fears death does not only build medicines and celebrations, it also builds walls, armies, and weapons, all in the same desperate service of survival. And it did not take long for someone to look at that eruption of fire and see not a festival but a way to destroy an enemy before the enemy destroyed them. The transition is written into the historical record with chilling clarity. By the late Tang and into the Song dynasty, roughly 1,000 years ago, gunpowder began appearing in military texts. There are records of fire arrows, arrows tipped with pouches of burning powder used in siege warfare. And then comes an invention that historians consider the true ancestor of every gun that would ever follow. The fire lance. Picture it. A soldier holding a long tube, often of bamboo, at first packed with gunpowder, and sometimes bits of shrapnel strapped to the end of a spear. When lit, it would erupt in a roaring jet of flame and debris, a handheld gout of fire aimed directly at an enemy's face. It was terrifying, short-ranged, and unpredictable. But it was the beginning. Take that tube, make it out of metal, let the pressure build behind a projectile instead of just spraying flame, and you have taken the first real step toward the gun. And we know how systematically this developed because of a single extraordinary document. Around the year 1044, Chinese scholars compiled a massive military manual known as the Wujing Zongyao, which translates as the Complete Essentials for the Military Classics. Buried inside this vast text are the earliest surviving written formulas for gunpowder made explicitly for war. In just 2 centuries, fire medicine had gone from a burned hand in an alchemist's workshop to a cataloged military technology with named weapons and standardized recipes. Imagine the scholars assembling that manual. They were not evil men. They were bureaucrats and soldiers trying to defend their state carefully, writing down the best knowledge of their age. And yet in doing so, they were documenting the industrialization of the accident, turning a spiritual mishap into a repeatable engine of destruction. The fire medicine had fully changed its meaning. It was no longer about cheating death. It was about delivering it. And the weapons kept getting more terrible. By the time of the Song Dynasty's desperate wars against invading armies, Chinese engineers had developed something far beyond a fire arrow. They built the thunderclap bomb and the thunder crash bomb cast iron shells packed with gunpowder that, when they burst, sent jagged fragments of metal tearing through the air. Historical accounts describe these bombs being hurled by catapults into enemy ranks, exploding with a noise like thunder that could be heard for miles, killing men inside their armor. One account of a siege describes iron bombs raining down until the attackers were torn apart. The gentle fire medicine of the alchemists had become an instrument of industrial slaughter, and only a few centuries had passed. Stop and feel the distance traveled here. A holy man heating minerals to find eternal life. And now, iron shells full of that same powder bursting over screaming soldiers. The same 3 ingredients. The same reaction, an entirely opposite purpose. Nothing about the chemistry had changed. Everything about the human intention had. And that shift from cure to carnage happened not because the powder wanted it, but because the people holding it did. Once a technology like this exists, it does not stay in one place. It spreads, carried by trade, by conquest, and by the simple fact that every ruler who hears of it desperately wants it before their rivals do. This is where the story leaves China and begins its march across the entire world. The knowledge traveled along the great trade routes and the paths of conquest most powerfully through the vast Mongol Empire, whose armies swept across Asia and into the edges of Europe, carrying Chinese technologies with them. By the 13th century, gunpowder weapons and the knowledge to make them had reached the Islamic world and then Europe. And here we meet another famous name. The English friar and philosopher Roger Bacon, writing around the year 1267 records, one of the first known European mentions of a gunpowder-like mixture. A Christian monk, an ocean of culture away from those Taoist alchemists, was now writing about the same violent powder. There is something almost eerie about that image. 2 very different men, separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years and completely different gods, both scholars, both seekers of hidden knowledge, both drawn to the same crackling secret. It is as if the powder itself had a gravity pulling curious minds toward it across every border humanity could erect. Bacon was so struck by its power and so wary of it that he is said to have written part of his description in a coded form, hiding the details even as he recorded them. Think about that instinct. The very first European to write about gunpowder already sensed that this was knowledge too dangerous to simply hand over a secret that needed to be both preserved and hidden at the same time. Even at the moment of its arrival in the West, the powder inspired the same mix of fascination and fear it had carried in China. Some things humans seem to know in their bones are as perilous as they are irresistible. And once Europe had it, the transformation of the whole world became unstoppable. The fire lance became the cannon. The cannon cracked open the stone castles that had defined medieval life. The armored knightmaster of the battlefield for centuries was rendered obsolete by a peasant with a gun. Entire social orders built on who could afford armor and horses collapsed because a cheap tube of metal and powder could kill a nobleman as easily as a commoner. Nowhere was this more dramatic than at the walls of Constantinople in the year 1453. For 1,000 years, that city's massive stone walls had been considered nearly unbreakable, turning back army after army. But the Ottoman forces besieging it brought something new: enormous cannons, some so large they had to be dragged by dozens of oxen capable of hurling stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds. Those walls, which had stood for a millennium, were battered into rubble in a matter of weeks. Picture the defenders on those ancient ramparts, watching stone that had protected 100 generations simply shatter under the impact of gunpowder. An age was ending in front of their eyes. The thick walls, the tall towers, the whole logic of the medieval fortress. All of it was suddenly obsolete, undone by the descendant of an alchemist's accident. What had begun as a search for endless life had just ended one of the longest-lived empires on Earth. And that brings us to the twist that reframes this entire story. We tend to think of gunpowder as a weapon that humans invented to gain power. But look again at where it actually came from. It did not come from a desire to kill. It came from a desire to never die. The most destructive substance of the pre-modern world was a failed byproduct of the most hopeful project imaginable, the quest to defeat death itself. Humanity went looking for a way to live forever, and came back, holding a way to end life faster than ever before. This is the dark symmetry hiding inside the human mind. The very same fear, the fear of death that drives us to build hospitals, invent medicines, write prayers, and dream of immortality, is the fear that drives us to build weapons, armies, and bombs. Both come from the same root: I do not want to die. And in the alchemist's furnace, those two branches of that single fear, the healing branch and the killing branch, were never really separate at all. They were tangled together from the very first spark. The reach to preserve life and the power to destroy it came out of the same hand, in the same room, in the same instant. And this is why it could not have gone any other way. You cannot ask a mind that badly to conquer death without that same mind learning along the way exactly how death works. To defeat something, you must study it, understand it, get close to it. The alchemist who spent his life trying to stop the body from dying was by necessity becoming an expert in the forces that end life. His knowledge was always double-edged. The moment he understood the world well enough to try to cheat death, he understood it well enough to deal it. Mastery over life and mastery over death are not opposites. They are the same mastery pointed in different directions. And a frightened, curious, wanting human being will always eventually point it both ways. That symmetry did not end in the Tang Dynasty. It is the pattern of your entire modern world. Think about the most powerful and terrifying technologies of your own era. The splitting of the atom gave humanity both nuclear medicine that saves lives in hospitals and nuclear weapons that could end civilization born from the very same discovery. The chemistry that produces fertilizer to feed billions of people is closely related to the chemistry that produces explosives to kill them. Again and again, the same knowledge that can preserve life can be turned almost effortlessly into a tool to destroy it. You are living inside the exact pattern that first appeared in that ancient Chinese laboratory. The alchemists were not a strange exception. They were the template. Look at the newest frontier of all the artificial intelligence being built in laboratories right now, and you will see the same two branches growing from the same trunk. The same systems designed to discover new medicines and cure diseases can, with a shift of intention, be turned toward designing new poisons and new weapons. The same fear that drives us to build tools that might save us drives us to build tools that might doom us. The furnace has simply changed shape. The mind bent over it has not. We are still the alchemist, still chasing the cure, still risking the catastrophe, still unable to tell in the moment of discovery which one we are actually holding. And the wanting machine in your brain has not changed either. The same dopamine-driven pursuit that kept those alchemists at the furnace keeps humanity racing toward every new powerful technology, chasing the next breakthrough, unable to stop even when we can see the danger, because the seeking itself feels like meaning. We are still the creature that cannot leave the mixture alone. We are still burning our own hands and coming back the next day to try again. So the next time you see fireworks bloom across a night sky, remember what you are really watching. You are watching the tamed ghost of a failed attempt at immortality. You are watching the exact reaction that scarred an alchemist's face 1,000 years ago. The reaction that would go on to topple castles, end the Age of Knights, and reshape every border on Earth. It began as fire medicine, a cure that was never a cure born from a fear that lives in you right now. Because in the end, gunpowder was not really a story about war at all. It was a story about a creature so afraid of dying that it was willing to risk everything, burn everything, and change everything just for the smallest chance of living a little longer. Your ancestors bent over that furnace were not so different from you. They were reaching for more life. And in that reach, trembling and desperate and utterly human, they accidentally grasp the power to take it away. You are trying to live forever. You always have been. And that, more than any battlefield, is where gunpowder was truly born.